Hello, and welcome to another season of the Storied Arcs podcast. I'm your co-host, Mike.
And I'm your co-host, Alex.
And today we are doing our creator spotlight on Dustin Nguyen and our series intro to Descender and Ascender by Jeff Lemire and Dustin Nguyen. And it's one of my favorite series. This is one that, honestly, I can't believe it took a year to get to in the podcast. It's just how things shake out. But for me, when someone is interested in comics but doesn't want to read capes, this is what I hand them. And I've done that at least 5 or 6 times. I've given this to people. Now it helps that it's one of those like image series that I think it has kind of a soft entry point, very easy to start reading, and it's a $10 first trade, so I don't mind gambling and saying, or even like the image first 99 cent. Oh, are they 99 cents anymore? They're not. The image first. If I give someone just the first single issue, yeah.
The reprints, yeah, no, I think they're
like $1. I mean, they're cheap.
They might be. There's something like that, yeah. But one of those reprints, yeah. But image first
between the first issue or the first trade, I have given it to 6 people to read.
So interesting. So I think we'll maybe go into this. We'll go into this next week, but talking about. I think in specific, it's interesting to think about this series and a lot of Jeff Lemire written series in terms of first issue versus first story arc. Put a pin in that. We'll talk about that next week because I have thoughts on that. But would you say, what is your reading relationship to this book? Not in terms of that you like it or not like it or things like that, which obviously you do. Was this is this your favorite Lemire written book? Or is this the first one you remember reading? Where does this fall for you? Because obviously you've said before multiple times that Jeff Lemire is your favorite creator. He is one of my favorites, but I think it's easy to say he is your favorite creator in comics. So
yeah, he's my favorite.
But before we start getting into the book/books, and talk a little bit about the story, the synopsis, where does this fall for you?
Yeah, so I came to this book after having discovered, Underwater Welder was like an early introduction to me for Lemire. I didn't read Sweet Tooth until it was completely out, and I had really fallen in love with Royal City. And so when I saw his name on this, I didn't know he was a writer only in some cases.
Okay.
I started flipping through this, and I was like, it said Jeff Lemire on the front. This does not look like Jeff Lemire. But as soon as you start reading it, you're like, oh yeah, it's Jeff Lemire. So I picked this up in like the 3rd or 4th quarter of 2016. So it was about halfway through the single issue series.
Okay.
So then I was kind of chasing it in trade. It's when issues like 1 through 5 were at their peak price because the trade wasn't out yet. Or maybe the first trade had just come out. But people were like, "Oh, this series is going to last a while, and it's got a good following." So it was the most difficult way to read it. I then collected it in trades. So I had the whole thing in single issue. Then I got it all in trades. Now I have the deluxe editions. So yeah, it's definitely one of my favorites of all time. And I think what I liked about it was I think Lemire writes good characters. It's the optimal balance for me between world building and character driven story, because I think he does a bit of world building, but you're never just dropped into exposition. There's not 5 issues straight where it's just like here's the history of the UGC and their entrenched battle with. In fact, now reading it for this series, what it reminds me of is when you start with Saga, you start with characters, even though the world building is extremely important and it's out in space and there's all these factions, but you encounter that stuff on a need to know basis.
Yeah.
Even though, in Saga, Brian K. Vaughan, knows what these planets are, knows their history, knows what's important on these characters. But you're only going to get that as you need it because that's not what the story is. That's the setting. So anyway, so that was my exposure to it. And I think, in my mind, it's a huge series, like a wildly popular series. And I think it's by 2015 Image standards, it was a pretty big series, but I think it was inflated in my mind because I had such just kind of a jaw-dropping experience reading Lemire and seeing Dustin's art together. And I'd encountered Dustin on some Batman and stuff. We'll get into Dustin's resume in a bit, but yeah. So that's a long roundabout answer.
I think that what interests me there is that I think we started reading this series, Descender, around the same time, because I didn't come to it until like late 2016, I think. So the way I read it was, this is a book that had been recommended to me by a number of people. And by a number of people, I guess it'd be like 4 maybe, which, if I got a handful of people like that telling me I should read a book, because it's like, this is a book you think you'll like. And it's a book I had missed. And I was not a huge Lemire guy. I hadn't read a lot of his stuff. And it's worth noting that Descender was his, at least in terms of publication order, I believe it was his first creator-owned book that he worked with a collaborator, that he didn't write and draw himself. Now, in quick succession, he had some other things come out, like Plutonia and things like that. There were other books in the works, but this was the first one in terms of reaching shelves that he worked with the collaborator on. But I came to this story. I ended up reading it in the first, I think, 16 or 17 issues. So about the halfway point of Descender, reading it all digitally, single issue. I'm pretty certain because there was a Black Friday deal on Comixology. It was probably an Image, a buy one get one free of like single issue trades, whatever, from Image, which was an excuse to be like, well, I guess I'll just buy all 16 of these or 17, however many were out at the time. I think it was 16 at the time.
This is the glory days of Comixology.
Yeah, this is back when it wasn't terrible. It was actually like usable and worthwhile to have. But so that was enough to spur me on to read it. And so I was in on it from there. And then obviously when Descender came to a close and they, immediately announced Descender would come a little bit later, I was in and all ready for it. So it's in terms of Lemire collaborations, like things that he doesn't write and draw himself, I think his stuff with Dustin Nguyen is my favorite. He has done a lot more, Lemire has, with Andrea Sorrentino, both at DC and Marvel, and also their own stuff. And of course they have their own Bone or Orchard Mythos thing going on at Image, their horror universe anthology, whatever it is, which is very cool and very creepy. But I think in terms of rereadability and books that I revisit, I think the books that Lemire has done with Nguyen are my favorite ones of Lemire's collaboration. So it was fun to go back and revisit Descender. Haven't made it back to Ascender quite yet. I haven't in my reread yet, but going back into Descender and really going off what you said there about how he does world building through character, I think really connecting with the characters very, very early and seeing how those bricks were laid before getting into like what's going on all these planets, like what's their government like, how's it set up, and realizing that none of that really matters. It's important, but none of it like really matters, because that's not what you're reading the book for. So no, it's been fun to go back and revisit this, and I'm looking forward to really getting into it. So that's where Descender is for me. So
it's hard to like talk too much about it without getting into it and spoiling it, which I think I would be better about, since I've recommended it to so many people. Yeah. So, well, we should. So you I know you said you give that first trade out to people, but we should probably say that that's not exactly how we're going to be covering this book as we talk about the next few weeks. We're going to be very similar to if you were listening back when we covered the Unwritten, we covered it 2 trades at a time, because we felt there was the story. Not necessarily necessitated that, but it fit the discussion to look at things in kind of 2 story arcs. So we'll be doing the same thing here with Descender and Ascender. So there are multiple ways to find Descender at this point. As we mentioned, it's 32 issues, so you could go out and find all 32 issues,
either physically or digitally or through your library or whatever. It is broken down into 6 trade paperback volumes, which is how we'll be using as our guideposts, I guess. We'll be covering volumes 1 through 2 the first week, next week, which is issues 1 through 11, then volumes 3 and 4, which is issues 12 through 21, and then volumes 5 and 6 to close out Descender, which is issues 22 to 32. So that's kind of the easiest way to go, because although probably not the most popular way to find Descender right now, it's probably a lot easier to find either the 2 deluxe editions, which are 16 issues each, or the 1 compendium, which is all 18 there. So if you go through one of those and you're using issue count, we'll have all that stuff in the show notes there. It may be a little harder to jump around. It's easier if you have the 6 trades, just go 2 at a time. And then following Descender, we'll go right into its sequel, Ascender, which, it was, 9 months, I think, after. And if I recall too, Descender ran from March 2015 to July 2018. And I want to say at the end of Descender 32, I think they had a teaser for Ascender. Like, I think there was already announced, even though Ascender number 1 didn't come out until April of the next year, April 2019. So, well after when the normal comic solicitation times. But I seem to recall that I haven't made it that far in my reread yet in the single issue, but I feel like it was announced. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe
now that you say that, I think you're right, and I think I still felt a little surprised when I saw the solicit for Ascender, because I thought Descender had such a satisfying autonomous ending.
It did. It was
not definitive. It wasn't like a closed book, like you could never tell a story in this world again.
Yeah.
But it was like, I feel satisfied with where we left off. But even then,
the story they chose with Ascender, not to spoil it too much, though, is not like it isn't like what happens the next day.
Right, it's not the next chapter.
Yeah. So even though there was a gap there, I recall there being like, yes, Descender's over, but and maybe it just said, maybe the sheet just said like 2019, so it was just next year. They didn't know when it was going to come yet, but I knew there was, when Descender ended, they made it clear that they were coming back for a sequel series again, which ended up being Ascender, which goes 18 issues. That's, as I mentioned, April 2019 through August 2021. Obviously there were 18 issues to cover that length of time. There were some issues in the world and some gaps and things that made things harder there. But in those 18 issues, that's broken down into 4 volumes, 4 trades. So we'll be covering that one, again, two trades at a time. So volumes 1 through 2, which are issues 1 through 10. And then volumes 3 and 4 will be the final discussion for this combined series. And that's issues 11 through 18. There is also a single deluxe edition, hardcover size, which I believe is the same physical size as the 2 deluxe editions for Descender, correct? So if you're on a shelf.
Yes. Although I will say, maddeningly, they're big, beautiful white books, and they're hardcovers. They're a little oversized, as you would expect from a deluxe. So it says Descender 1, Descender 2, and then it just says Ascender. And I was I thought it'd be cool if they added 3. I understand why, because if it's sitting on the shelf at the comic shop and it just says Ascender alphabetically and it says number 3, someone would not be inclined to pick it up and look at it, because they'd think this is number 3 in a series, which it is of sorts. But I think Ascender, I'm curious to know if it would stand on its own. I want to give it to someone who's never read Descender. And by the way, you mentioned the compendium, which I had no idea, because I prefer compendiums to deluxe. It's out March 19th, 2024.
Oh, it's not out yet. Okay. All right. That's what I get for not checking the dates there. So there will be a compendium. So depending on when you were listening to this, if it's sometime in the future, it's possible you could find the compendium for Descender. So
well, and if you're listening far enough out, you'll probably have an Ascender compendium, but I would imagine that's at least another year off from the Descender one.
Well, but also you don't really need a compendium for that, because it is just one. I mean, they already have
4 trades. I mean,
but they have the deluxe, which is all 18, and that's the whole series. So
that's true. I'm curious to see if they would consider doing it, because again, I'd prefer not to have the oversized if possible.
Yeah. Well, well, the oversize is always tough, as we've talked about. That's kind of it looks good on a shelf versus how cumbersome is it to read.
No, you completely won me over on that, because I used to have all these deluxe editions, and I still, occasionally will have an Omni if it's like something that, I don't mind sitting down and reading in that way. But I was trying to lay on the couch and read this deluxe edition, and I'm not a small guy. I have big hands, whatever, and I still found it cumbersome to hold it open while laying down.
Yeah,
then I sat up in a chair, and it was perfectly fine to read. But
yeah, if it's on your lap, or if you have it on a table, or some sort of reading, something you can rest it on, sure, it's always great. And
it does lay flat, like it's nice.
Oh binding. Yeah. And obviously when it's oversized, you really get an eyeful of the artwork, and which is obviously why they want to have books like that, so you can really get that really beautiful visuals. So it all comes down to, sometimes those are hard to read, which is why I'm personally not a fan of them, but I understand why they exist. And I'm not going to sit here and lie and say that it doesn't look awesome on a shelf. If you've got a bunch of those deluxe editions or omnibuses or absolute editions or whatever they are, it looks pretty dope on a shelf if you got a big line of them. So
I'm not against them. A diehard fan of the series, it is a little bit of a collector's item, because there's a little more bonus stuff in the back than the sum of all the parts of the trades.
You get a lot of process stuff. Yeah. The one thing I do wonder about this, because you actually mentioned it offhandedly, the idea that if you were to look on a shelf and you were to see Ascender, obviously alphabetically comes before Descender there. But if you are the kind of person who maybe files their personal shelf based on something other than alphabetical, you would obviously put Ascender after Descender, correct? Which makes me wonder, with this compendium that's coming out, like, why wouldn't they just do a compendium with Descender and Ascender together?
That's what I've been waiting for. Because I was that's about 50 issues, which is the same as Saga's compendium.
Because to me, that would be what compendium is. Because otherwise, there's no reason to put Ascender out, because that deluxe edition is the entire series. So I wonder if they would do that at some point. Just to, then I guess by doing that, you kind of swallow up the Ascender title, because it would clearly be, you would call it Descender, like that's how it would be filed. That would be the first name on it. So in a way, you would almost lose that title. So I can see why they wouldn't want to, but it does seem to make a whole lot of sense. If you're going to put a compendium out, throw out the whole series as it is,
that's how I feel. Yeah. Otherwise, you're technically doing like a paperback Omni, which is like what Black Hammer is doing right now. Yeah. They're not calling it compendiums.
Yeah. And which they could very well do, but then that Ascender compendium could just be, it really could just end up being the soft cover deluxe edition. Maybe it's got some extra stuff in the background. Right. Maybe they put some stuff, some different back matter in, but so it makes me wonder, because I actually don't know, and I will be with the question you brought up earlier about how Ascender would read as a standalone. I will, when I get there in my reread for our discussions, that's something I'll keep in mind. In terms of like, how would this read cold? I think that's something we should think about.
It's a really interesting question.
Yeah. Because because if we don't think it functions on its own, then it almost like doesn't have a reason to be on its own, then in which case it should get swallowed up and just be Descender
36 through 50 or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And just have the time jump built in there, which, you end on 32, and then 9 months later, here's Descender 33, and oh my God, the story is completely different, but yet it's still the same. That's an interesting kind of thought exercise.
No, because I can't think of another series that does exactly that, because and maybe he learned from it, because in over at Dark Horse, it's always Black Hammer : this name of the series.
I was just going to say that in terms of what we've covered, it would have been something like the Unwritten, where as the Unwritten was coming out, it technically ended at the end of Volume 9. And then sorry, you mentioned Black Hammer. Damn, it's on my mind now. The Unwritten, the second volume of the Unwritten was technically called Unwritten: Apocalypse in single issue. And now that, of course, that story picked up right at the end. So it wasn't like it felt like a different series. And when that came to be put in trade, they dropped that and it's just called, instead of being Unwritten Apocalypse Volume 1, Unwritten Apocalypse Volume 2, they just called it Unwritten's Volume 10 and 11. Like they understood that when it came to the collection aspect, but from a single issue standpoint, it was a different title with a whole new number 1 and all that. Now maybe they felt because Ascender was such a left turn from Descender in terms of, even though it's the same physical world, like the same, the same characters, the same idea, the same setting. But maybe they felt it deserved to be something different. But I would be curious how they feel about that, knowing that it was a sequel and a follow-up, but like a legacy sequel follow-up,
Right.
It's
almost... and I think if someone is listening now and has not read yet, and they decided to like take us up on our challenge and go read Ascender first, I think you would have a jarring experience going to Descender number 1 after finishing Ascender, because the worlds feel a little different, even though it's all in continuity. There are just plot devices in Ascender that don't exist in Descender.
Yeah, that is. I am wondering though. I don't know why this is popping up in my brain with this comparison, but even though it was less than a year between the end of Descender beginning and beginning of Ascender, but in a slight spoiler for Ascender is the story that picks up years later after the end of Descender. So in terms of the setup, so for people listening who maybe haven't read it, that's you get your story in Descender, the story ends, and then Ascender picks up years later, years down the line. So it's almost, from a story standpoint, it's like a legacy sequel. And the thing that clicked in my brain is like Top Gun Maverick or Tron Legacy or something like that. You could theoretically watch Top Gun Maverick and not have to watch the first Top Gun. And
that's exactly what I did.
Yeah. You had never seen the first Top Gun?
No.
What?
I know.
Did we cover this in the show? Did we discuss this?
We've never discussed it. I'm usually ashamed of it, but since it worked right there,
you didn't watch Top Gun? Oh my God.
I was way too young when it came out. And then I have this hang up where I always think I don't like Tom Cruise. And then I end up liking every movie I see him in.
Again, this is where that just the small age gap between us is like the Grand Canyon.
Becoming a chasm, yeah.
Yeah.
Top Gun came out when I was 84. Not yet 1 year old.
84, 85, maybe?
86 is what I'm seeing.
Oh, God, 86. Jesus.
Yeah. No, 84, I wouldn't be born yet.
Wow.
I was born in 85.
But so that discussion aside, that's what clicked in my mind. The idea of it is a legacy sequel story. We're going to revisit a story we left years ago, even though in the actual timeline, Lemire and Nguyen didn't leave the story. It said
right.
They continue to run on, but they made a time jump in the story. So I think it's the difference between
Star Wars Episode 3 and Episode 4, except Lucas did it backwards. Lucas started with 4.
Yeah. And you can say the same thing with 6 and 7 as well. The idea
right.
of jumping
it's about
in
30 years.
Yeah, and saying we're going to something new. So as we get into talking about it, I'd be curious about it, because it talks about a lot of the same themes that Descender will talk about. Something that we'll highlight, I think, a little here when we give a little summary of it. But the fact that it's built on the same foundation, but like it's an entirely different house,
Right.
Do you need that background? I'd be curious. I'm gonna try to keep that in mind when I get to Ascender in my reread.
Yeah, I like to think that I can be that kind of objective, but it is a series that I've Descender anyway is a series that I've read multiple times already. Ascender, I just did once straight through when it came out. Enjoyed it, yeah. But I didn't have near the level of enjoyment or awe that I did with Descender. Sure. So I'm wondering now that it doesn't feel like an add-on. Now it's been part of the canon for so long. It's been, and it's a finalized series. I don't know. For some reason, it still felt a lot newer to me than Descender.
Well, and you know what? I'll throw this out there too as a non-spoiler thing too. Your family situation is different now.
That is true. Yeah.
So it is possible that Ascender will hit differently. So
yes. Yeah. No, and I'm not saying I didn't enjoy it. It just didn't.
Oh no. Yeah, I'm saying in terms of how you read it now.
Extra.
Yeah. There's a different layer for your approach to that story now, and how some of that may mean, as with so much of Lemire's work, and I think something that we'll get into as we go through our discussions in the coming weeks, of just, even though this is set in a science fiction world with way out in the future, I guess we're assuming, with robots and AI and space travel and all this stuff and different planets and different life forms and all that, like, it's still ultimately about like family and parents and children and relationships,
Yeah,
it's still,
you made it sound like it just, now it's part of the Fast and Furious franchise.
Yeah, wait,
it's all about family.
But that's all. I mean, everything Lemire does has some tinge of, whether it's parents and children, siblings, found family, whatever it is, there's always some, that's the hook there. And there's almost always some connection to the past or some lost past.
Well, trying to reconnect.
Lemire, trying to reconnect with something there. Yeah.
It's always, despite whatever difficulty, frustration, challenge, the underlying family connection always ends up being a positive one. I'm trying to think of an example as I speak extemporaneously, but I'm pretty sure there's always something fortifying about that family connection for the character, even if the family wasn't great.
What I was going to say, it's not that it was always good. It's just that maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed, and that there was always some silver lining. There's always some positive there. Not saying that everything was good and excuse the things you thought were bad. It always comes out. It comes out as a net positive. Always comes. Right. Even if that's a net positive of 1, and
right. And I realized the only other one we covered on this podcast was a father-son relationship, which was sandbagging the son's life.
Yeah, which was not great. But yet at the end, he comes to a greater understanding of his father and his family, for good and for ill,
and still has a strong relationship with his mom and his wife.
Yeah. Or he ends up with one. It sours during the course of the story in Underwater Welder, because of this obsession with his father in the past. And he almost ruins his relationship with both of them. So it's a common theme, and it said, even though Descender is set in a futuristic world, we have robots and AI. There is something very prescient about reading the story now, in terms of the kind of stories we see, whether it's just stories about AI, robotics. You think about a movie that came out recently as we record this, The Creator. There's a lot of visual cues that, when I have not seen The Creator, I haven't watched the movie because I heard it wasn't very great. But in terms of seeing the art for it, the promo stuff, the trailers, there's a lot of stuff in that where, if you've read Descender and you've seen Dustin Nguyen's artwork, especially with the main character, Tim 21, and you look at the promos for The Creator, you're going to think like, that seems awfully familiar. There's some, thematically,
for sure.
Maybe not. But
I think you
artwork,
just identified why I was much more drawn to that movie than I think I otherwise would have been, because I didn't see it either, because I don't have time to see movies the way I would like to. I still would have seen it despite the reviews if I weren't.
I'll watch it eventually. Yeah.
But yeah, when I was like, man, something about this, just, I like the vibe. I like the feeling, and it was cinematically, it looked beautiful. I do like the cast. But I think also I was picking up on the Descender vibe.
Yeah. I mean, there's a distinct. There's something about the AI robot head brain area where, back in the back of your skull, that has to apparently has to be some sort of cylindrical shape or device, right at the kind of base of the skull, top of the neck, right, kind of where your ears would be. That seems to be a universal design of oh, this means it's a machine. This is an AI. And obviously, if you've seen the creator, the promo stuff of the creator, that's hollow. So the whole idea is that it's kind of see-through there. But as we'll get into the story with Descender, and I'm sure we'll get to it more next week. Whenever we see some of these higher advanced AI robots, maybe without the skin or whatnot, there's a design there that looks super, super similar. So, Descender and some of the ideas, the ideas about, again, robots and AI and personhood are still very prevalent in storytelling now. And it seems to be one of our recent recurring kind of story ideas, right? With starting kind of with Not All Robots, which is obviously a much different, humorous, absurdist take on AI and robotics. If you were listening with our crossover with Cole on the Talkabon podcast when we talked about Pluto, which harkens back to Astro Boy back in the day, the idea of what is human, what does it mean to be human,
which I think
AI achieve ultimately actual thought and all that things of that nature. Yeah.
Ultimately shows how evergreen those issues are.
Oh, absolutely. It's about what kind of spin you put on it, right? Because are robots humans or whatnot is the robot revolution, whatever it is. Robots as a stand-in for bigotry, as otherness. All things that we see here in Descender and Descender. So yeah, it's all about what other coat you put on it. What is your story about? And I think you mentioned it earlier, is the idea that all that's the world building stuff for Lemire and Nguyen. All that is the dressing of, this is the world we're in. Here's the environment we're in. But the story isn't about that. The story is about found family. It's about the characters and pretty much it's the characters and their relationship to Tim 21.
Right.
Everyone that's in his orbit, that comes into contact with him, and in the way that he affects them or has affected them. So yeah, it is. There's a letter in the back of one of the earlier issues. I guess they don't start running letters in the single issues until like issues 4 or 5 or something like that. And there's a letter early on where one of the writers in was like deriding other letter writers for calling this sci-fi, calling Descender sci-fi, as if that was like reductive, because it's so much more than that. It's not about the robotics or the space travel and things like that. And there's an argument to be made there, that that is the genre in which it falls. But in terms of what it's about, again, it's not about the space travel and the lasers and the robotics and things like that. It's not about that. That's just the world that it's set in.
Yeah,
it still makes it sci-fi.
I know. I was going to say, I think that's limiting of what sci-fi is. That's
exactly.
Saying it has to be, but that's when I give like Saga to people, and someone I gave it to said like, "Oh, I don't really like sci-fi." I was like, "Well, it's kind of a Western and a romance."
Yeah.
It's also in a sci-fi setting.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
Just I'm like, whatever genre you like, it's that. And whatever genre you don't like, that aspect of this story isn't going to bother you, because I don't read romances.
Yeah.
But it's a beautiful romance in Saga. And that's something that, Lemire almost never touches. There's very little romantic element in
there is,
in his stories, which I kind of like, because I feel like in a lot of storytellers, they like, it feels like a note from the publisher to like the Hollywood pitch room. It's like, yeah, you got a great movie here, but what if the guy and girl character got together? And it's like, but like, it's a complete story. You just said it was a great story without that. They're like, yeah, but like some people, they really need the romance. It's just stick a romantic plot line in there and it'll just kind of be there. And I think Lemire never shoves one in for the sake of it.
I think a lot of Lemire stories are like post love story. Like we're seeing what happened after,
Which,
either one of the parties has passed on, and so the surviving person is left with regret and memory, or they have broken up. There's something there, but he does seem to write post love story, post romance, in terms of where his characters are set up. But yeah, I mean, this is a Descender there's a different kind of love here. There is a sibling familial love here. It's not romantic love in terms of what drives it. There is larger connection, larger interpersonal connection that he taps into, and that's a hallmark of Lemire written stories. Regardless of where they're set, there's always some sense of longing for that connection.
Yeah.
Whether that is with a partner, a sibling, a child, found family, friends, whatever it is, there's always some sort of longing for that connection that is present in all of his stories. So this one just happens to be in a world where there are highly advanced AI robots, and other, I guess they're referred to as all humans, but they're all humanoid, right? They're different aliens, different races, things like that. They're all humanoid species, but I think we would look at them in our world, look at them as alien. But
yeah, right.
We meet a character like Driller, who we'll talk about next week, just looks at everyone as human. Anything that's flesh is just human, right? But
right.
we would look at them as just different humanoid species. So even though it's set in this far off, this different world, distant galaxy, distant time, the theme there is still the same. It's about connection.
Yeah. I think that does it for a plot in terms of, like, if you aren't on board yet, there's nothing we can say without spoiling stuff.
Yeah, well, if we keep talking, we'll definitely go too far. So,
I've just restrained myself like 6 times from jumping in and being like, oh. So yeah, let's talk about Dustin.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, written by Jeff Lemire and it's lettered by Steve Wands. Again, Steve Wands letters almost everything that
I was going to say. Can I ask you what's wrong with me? I was like halfway through the first issue on this reread, and I was like, man, these letters are just perfect. I wonder who did it. And I flipped to the front and it was like, what is wrong with me?
Yeah.
Why would I think but I was like, maybe back in 2015, he didn't have Steve Wands on lockdown yet.
He does everything.
He's had him locked down forever.
Everything Lemire pretty much writes and creates. We covered both of them back when we did the Underwater Welder. So you can scroll back, or we'll have a link to that in the show notes here. So you can go and we covered Lemire in depth. So we're not going to go back into that again. But we do want to cover Dustin Nguyen, who is the artist here, not to be confused with an actor named Dustin Nguyen, actor and martial artist who's been around. Dustin Nguyen is he's one of my favorite artists. He is one of those artists that actually is unique. I believe he is instantly recognizable with his artwork. There aren't many artists. There are a lot of artists that I love that are great, that not necessarily are, reminiscent of other artists or things like that, but you look at it and it's awesome, but you got to take a second. Okay, wait, that's that person. That's that. There are a handful that you can just see from afar and be like, I know exactly who that is. Just in terms of what the line work looks like, in terms of how it's colored, maybe the medium that he's working in, whatever it is. Dustin Nguyen is one of those artists that when I see his stuff on a cover, on a print, or whatever it is, I know immediately that it's him. And that automatically makes me interested.
I can't say it any better, because I was thinking the exact same thing. I was like, there are artists, I really love their work, but you have to really follow them to be able to pull it apart. Because and again, I want to say this is a positive thing. But when I think of like a Steve Pugh, I'm like, okay, well, now I've read enough Steve Pugh that I notice it. But to the lay person, I think it looks like, oh, it's comic art. It's good comic art, but it's comic art.
Yeah.
Whereas when you see Dustin's work, it's just like, this is something completely other.
Well, yeah, and there's someone like Steve Pugh, who I think is fantastic storytelling or whatnot. If I see a cover of his, I'm not going to jump out and be like, that's Steve Pugh cover. But I'll look at it, I'll pick it up, be like, oh, right, I know who this is now. But yes, across the room, I can see some artists, and Dustin Nguyen is one of them, where I just look at it and be like, that's a Nguyen cover. I'm gonna go check that out because I'm interested in seeing what in seeing his work, and he is someone that has done just an incredible amount of covers, both whether he's the main cover artist, where he does variant covers, that could be incentive covers. He has done them, and he has to list the number of series that he's provided covers for, we would be here all day. But he has mainly done. So I think he got his start with Wildstorm in the early aughts. Wildstorm at that point when it was an imprint of DC after moving from Image. So I think he got his foot in the door at Wildstorm, worked on some books like The Authority, Manifest Eternity, Wildcats, before moving into kind of DC proper. And, I think like a lot of people, you move into DC and the majority of your work is going to be Batman focused,
right.
That is, and he pretty much got into that. He pretty much got into the Gotham room, whether it's doing various issues of Batman or detective or spinoffs or things like that. Most notably, if you were to ask, I think if you were to look and see like what his most popular work was as an interior artist, I think it's his run in Detective Comics that he did with Paul Dini. People know Paul Dini's name probably from Batman the Animated Series. He was a writer there who wrote on Tiny Toons as well. He's a co-creator of Harley Quinn. They had a run on Detective, a handful of issues, but the most notable was issues 846 to 850, which is called Heart of Hush, which was a sequel to the original Hush storyline that Jeff Loeb and Jim Lee did back in, what was that, like 03, 04. And so, this run of Detective, I think, was like 08, 09, something like that. He said basically a direct sequel, and I think it was the first time Hush had really been back in a storyline since that original series. And then after their run on Detective finished up, they started another series, another kind of Batman imprint called Batman Streets of Gotham. Where it's kind of thing of like, hey, they had a really successful run on Detective. We're going to move them off Detective and put them on their own story now. And I think that ran for 3 different story arcs. And again, they also used Hush quite a bit there. This is a weird time in DC and Batman. It's like post like Final Crisis, like Batman RIP, like Batman's dead or thought he was dead. He was back in time. This is weird. This is right before New 52 and things like that. But it was a way for them to kind of keep telling stories together, Nguyen and Dini, and really get into the character of Hush, who was, super cool, super awesome, introduced by Loeb and Lee, and then kind of never went back to. It was kind of left for other people to pick up, and Paul Dini and Dustin Nguyen together probably wrote more of the more Hush than kind of anyone else had in terms of using him as a major character, both as kind of a villain and anti-hero kind of thing. So if you're looking for Dustin Nguyen's DC work, it's probably going to be related around Hush and Heart of Hush too, that Detective Comics run. If you've read the original Hush story by Jeff Loeb and Jim Lee, definitely go find Heart of Hush. That's collected in its own trade. Those 5 issues of Detective Comics are out there as Heart of Hush. Definitely worth checking out. Definitely worth reading.
Which interestingly, I'm a huge fan of Hush and never read Heart of Hush because I just thought, I didn't look at the creative team or anything. I just thought, oh, that's just a classic lame follow up on, whenever there's a big name like Hush and they're like, people will buy anything that we write the word Hush on now. Yeah. I thought it might be one of those. So my cynicism was not rewarded, and I will go pick up Heart of Hush.
Definitely go check it out. The other thing I think Nguyen is noted for in DC and kind of in general, this may be a weird comparison, but there is a, speaking of artists that are instantly recognizable across the room, artists that are like actually unique in their artwork and approach. There is a spiritual similarity between Dustin Nguyen and Scotty Young. If you know Scotty Young's work, Scotty Young, for lack of a better term, he draws the babies. And both of these guys have what I refer to as like a Muppet Babies aspect of art and character at times, where we're just taking all the characters that we know and just they're all babies, but they're still all the various Robins and Batgirls and Batman and all that stuff. They're still the Riddler, but it's just like looks like a baby, or just there's something infantile about it. Scotty Young's work is a little more cartoonish, I guess. Its approach versus what Dustin does, but Dustin does have there is something in his art where everyone, like, he tends to have a hard time drawing people that look old. I'll put it that way. There is something about his adult characters. There is something about the way he draws where unless he's putting like heavy effort into the faces, and we're talking about like heavy lines and wrinkles, probably disguised with facial hair, things like that. He has a hard time drawing characters that look old. There is a natural youth depiction in the way he draws. And so drawing kids, drawing children, drawing characters who are adults as young characters, this kind of is in his wheelhouse. And that really comes up in a series called, it was a Batman : Lil Gotham, which I think initially was a digital series. And there's a couple of those, like a Batman Beyond or a Batman series that started out as digital series through, I guess, whatever DC's old digital platform was. They were digital series first that eventually had come out into print. But Batman Lil Gotham, like that is basically, that's like the Muppet Babies version of the DC universe of Batman stories. It is all ages. It is very fun. It is childlike. And it is something that fits the way Dustin Nguyen draws character. And it's a fun read. It's something that is different. It is out there. But when you see his artwork, again, if you're familiar with Scotty Young's work, you'll see the similarity there. So in terms of the kind of things, if you were to find outside of the stuff that Nguyen has done with Jeff Lemire, which is probably his most popular stuff, in terms of what you would find at DC, you would probably find that Detective Run, that Streets of Gotham, or you'll find issues of Lil Gotham. So, and I don't know,
but like if almost exclusively Batverse stuff. Special series like the Robin and Batman stuff.
It's almost his DC work was almost exclusively Bat Family, and I have to assume he was DC exclusive for a long time, because he only started doing Marvel work, like doing covers for Marvel, in literally the last couple of years. As we record this in 2023, we're saying maybe since like 2021 ish has he done a handful of covers, and I don't think he's done any real interior work at Marvel, but he has started to do some covers. So while still also doing a bunch of covers and variants for DC work. Earlier this year, again in 2023, DC did this giant Line One event called Night Terrors, which in my mind wasn't very great, but there were a whole bunch of, it was every character, every line pretty much got a 2-issue miniseries on this Night Terrors, and Dustin did a variant for every single number one. They were called the Midnight variants, and they were awesome. The entire line, they were red, black, and white only in terms of what he used and how he deployed his images for each of these characters. And they're the kind of line that I was tempted to buy every single one of them. So I had the whole full line of it.
Yeah. It's like a Ross Timeless or something.
Yeah. Or so cool. A Darwin Cook month or something like that. But yeah, the fact that they were so striking on the cardstock covers, black, red, and white, so evocative. So he's still doing a ton of work there. But he also said recently there was a Loki miniseries over at Marvel where he did the covers on. And it's just like, oh, right. God, it's cool to see him draw these other characters. And it makes me want to see him draw more characters in the Marvel universe. Like he did a variant cover for a Strange Academy miniseries, which was really, really great. But it's just like, I want to see him draw the X-Men. Like I need Dustin Nguyen to draw the X-Men. Just, I don't care what they're doing. Just give me a whole cover. Give me a wraparound cover.
At the next time you see him at a Comic-Con.
Yes, yeah, which that would probably cost me my kidney at this point. But no. Nguyen is, I've been at a handful of cons. Always super, super cool. Willing to sign whatever. Very, very nice. He's really, 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 really cool. But yeah, now that he's doing a little more work for Marvel, maybe he can do some other stuff there. I want to see him draw more over there and not just Bat Family characters, which at this point I think everyone knows he can draw. So
yeah, and I picked up in 2019 there was a Dark Horse series called Strayed, which the pitch was basically down Main Street for me anyway. It's a sci-fi adventure about a cat who has the ability to do astral projections. But the first issue had a variant from Dustin. Mm-hmm. And I went into the store to buy Strayed #1, and they had the variant next to it. And I was like, I'm usually like an A cover guy for everything. I try not to, but I was like, oh, that's Dustin. I'll take that. And 100%. And the interesting thing to me, and I think this speaks to not just the medium he uses, but his pencils and line work and everything. If you see covers on a wall at a comic shop, and it's very rare that you'll see variants using watercolor, there's primarily two people in my mind that jump to mind immediately, which is Peach and Dustin, and they're nothing alike.
Yeah.
Which is wild to say when it's like, oh, they're both watercoloring. You would think like, oh, you'd have to pause for a second, and it's like, no, Peach's lines are Peach's lines.
Yeah,
and the watercolor, and Dustin is Dustin.
Yeah,
they're just so for two people who kind of trade in the same medium of watercolor variants, you would think there'd be some similarity, but there really isn't.
Yeah, no, yeah, and
and Lemire will do a watercolor variant every once in a while.
Oh yeah, when he does,
and Lemire's Lemire.
Exactly. Yeah,
there's four characters.
Yeah, but they're that's I think it's a good call out in terms of the medium and also the kind of the color work. Both Peach Momoko and Dustin Nguyen, there's a lot of, because it is kind of a watercolor. There's a natural kind of washed out to it nature to the color. It's a little more muted, right. Not always as bright, and so you would think there would be a comparison. But when you look at the covers, Peach Momoko is someone else that you're like, oh yeah, that's one of her covers. It doesn't matter what it is. We'll wrap up here on Dustin. Last things I'll say is, going back to another book that we discussed on this show, The Good Asian, which, as we mentioned, all the main covers were done by Dave Johnson. He's a great cover artist, but all the variants and reprint covers and second print and multiple printings were done by various Asian and Asian American artists. And Dustin did the cover for the second printing of Good Asian #1. So it wasn't one of the planned variants, or maybe it was a planned variant and didn't have space for it, so they used it as the second printing. But he was one of the artists that contributed to that series as well, which is always very cool to see, because that was just an absolute killer lineup of variant cover artists for The Good Asian. And we'll wrap here by talking about his work with Jeff Lemire. Obviously, Descender and Ascender are the books he's most known for. Should also mention that Dustin's work on Descender earned him 2 Eisner Awards. He won twice for Best Painter / Digital Artist in both 2016 and 2019, which effectively were the years following the beginning and end of Descender. Descender starts March 2015, and so in the 2016 year he's rewarded, and then it ends in July 2018, and so in 2019 he's rewarded again for his work on Descender. So 2-time Eisner Award winner for his work specifically on this book. But there are 2 other series that he's done with Lemire. A series that just wrapped up recently called Little Monsters, which is about a group of vampire children, kind of at the end of the world.
Which I can't believe how long that series went.
It went 11 issues, I think. Yeah, 11, okay. 12 issues, something like that. Yeah. So, it's a maxi series, I guess what it is there. But again, my bad. It's 13 issues. But still, that's a maxi series length. Again, it's about.
Right. I thought it was going to be 5 or 6 when I picked up the first one.
Yeah.
And then I just kept saw it coming for months and months, and I was like, I'm going to have to catch it, Trey, because it wasn't ultimately my thing, even though I will finish it now that I know. No, it's only 13.
It's a good series. Again, there are similar ideas of found family and connection, with the twist that obviously when you're talking about vampires, connection means something a little different there. And then they also did a book for DC, which was interesting. That I was shocked when they did this. It was a 3 oversized issues, like they were perfect bound or square bound oversized issues. It was called Robin and Batman. So again, focusing on younger characters in Robin. And this is a story about the early kind of days and training of Robin, of Dick Grayson as the first Robin, as he learns to be Robin, trains with Batman, as he meets the Justice League and his early days with the Teen Titans. It's a story kind of focused on that. And it's a cool kind of take, whether it's in continuity or whatnot, doesn't really matter. It's fun to see him, to see Nguyen draw those characters from that era and have Lemire write those stories. So, you know, they have their creator and stuff there, but they've also done a little work on, a little for hire work with Robin and Batman. Everything I think he does with Lemire, I think is great and worth checking out. There's always something special when those two guys get together and tell a story.
For sure.
Yep.
Well, that's all I've got to say about him, other than I will be praising, specific panels and pages as we go through the series, because how can you not?
Yeah, we'll try and keep that to a minimum, and not make the whole podcast, hey, look at that page. Hey, look at this page. Hey, look at that page. We'll try and avoid that, but it will be inevitable because he is one of my favorite artists. Just kind of working in general, whether it's doing a cover or doing an interior work. He's someone whose stuff I buy, just because I'm banking on the fact that at some point in the future I'll see him at a con. So I go out and collect a healthy backlog of stuff, and then show up with a big stack of stuff at his table when he's there. I said he's always super kind and gracious to talk and go through it and sign stuff. He's awesome.
Yeah, I go to a lot fewer cons than you, but I would still love to meet him. But I know I'm going to have to leave the city to meet him. He's not going to be at the Cincinnati con anytime soon.
He could, depending on who they get. But Chicago, he's been in C2E2 in Chicago a couple times, so that's not the worst hike in the world. We'll see coming up.
All right, well, thank you for listening. Grab Descender 1 through 6 and Ascender 1 through 4 volumes. The single issues, the deluxe editions.
Wait. Oh, grab all of them. I'm saying for next week.
Next
week, though.
Grab them all.
Just for next week.
But we're going to move at a relative breakneck pace for us, which is 2 trades a week.
Yeah.
But for next week, just grab 1 and 2, issues 1 through 11, and read those, and tune in next Thursday, and we'll see you then.
Peace.